Akina was a young girl who'd grown up in rural Japan, and she'd just met Paul, a final-year architectural student. With the summer vacation coming up, she invited Paul to Japan to visit her native country with her. Following a long flight to Japan, they took a bus to her hometown, about 10 kilometers east of Osaka. On the way, Paul kept questioning Akina about her village, their local traditions, and history. His excited questions were as long as her answers were short. Traditionally, their cultures were as different as night and day. Paul was very outgoing, chatty, and curious, while Akina's eyes remained fixed, peering at the countryside and calmly listening to Paul. After the bus suddenly stopped on the side of a country road, Akina told Paul to politely get their bags from the bus. She talked about her village and how their traditions required that no motor vehicles were permitted beyond where they'd stop. Now they would complete the rest of the journey by foot, only minutes away, through a beautiful forest. Akina explained more about their traditions as they happily approached the ancient village where she'd grown up. In the distance, Paul was able to make out a village of very old, tiny homes built side by side. He could now recognize the feudal Japanese architecture from the Edo and Azuchi-Moyama periods. Paul had grown even more excited as Akina talked about how the newest of the homes were built in the 1860s, but the majority were far more ancient, built from stone and wood, with moss and algae covering the outside walls. The village wasn't very large. It was surrounded by thick woods, and it appeared as a completely different world. During the bus ride, Akina had introduced her village as a traditional village specialized in papermaking and silk weaving. Paul had listened, filled with admiration, and he felt extremely thankful and blessed to be part of this trip. As they walked deeper inside the village, Akina explained that every night the villagers would gather in large numbers on the streets and squares after their long day of work. This surprised Paul, who could only see empty streets, devoid of any soul. There weren't even any children playing around, which he found odd. But because he was afraid of offending Akina, he refrained from mentioning it. Akina led Paul down a narrow alley until they reached a peculiar little house at the end of the street. Paul was observing her with awe and admiration as she gently pushed the door open with her delicate hand. A rancid and moldy stench immediately wafted in their direction, causing Paul to sneeze. The room was dim. Paul could feel human presence, and this was confirmed by Akina bowing toward all sides of the room. Paul instinctively bowed as well, fully aware that this was the only efficient way of communicating with his foreign host. However, his greeting was only met with silence. Akina's relatives were sitting around a large danabi filled with steaming rice. Despite the darkness, he could see the steam coming out of the white, fluffy mound, but the surrounding relatives' faces were still blurry. Akina asked Paul to wait here for her return. As she walked out into an adjacent house, Paul felt all the more strange that only men, especially a middle-aged one, was greedily eating rice. Meanwhile, the remaining women just put their hands on their lap, apparently without any intention to eat. Paul was kneeling next to the door, waiting for Akina's return. The men continued to eat rice, more and more greedily. It appeared as if they'd been starved for a very long time. Out of curiosity, Paul decided to stand up and move closer to observe these peculiar, greedy hosts. But suddenly, he felt a strong arm clutching his shoulder. A short man was standing behind him, and he could see the side of his cold and grimacing face. Paul began looking around for Akina, hoping that she would end this uncomfortable, tense situation. When she finally came back, she was wearing a gorgeous peach-colored kimono. As she saw Paul's worried face, Akina laughed softly and introduced the menacing man as her father. She then smiled and squinted at Paul as if to comfort him. Gently taking his hand, she began pulling him towards the door. Because it was all so unexpected, Paul could only turn his head to look back a little bit, but wasn't able to see her family properly. Behind him, he could feel Akina's father staring at his shoulders. As he was turning around, Paul was startled to realize that all the relatives had turned around to look at him with grimacing faces and evil stares. The afternoon had begun, and as they were walking down the streets, the surroundings were becoming gloomier and gloomier. As if to bring instant relief, the lights from all the houses simultaneously lit up, and the town began filling up with villagers coming from all sides. Paul felt like he was the center of everyone's attention. He could sense the surrounding whirlwind. He didn't understand why, and how more and more people kept appearing from nowhere. Quite strangely, the town wasn't getting any noisier, as if the villagers were breathless ghosts whose steps didn't make any sound. The atmosphere was getting heavier by the minute, and Paul's guts were telling him something was wrong. He was hoping Akina would give him some sense of relief. Paul could not suppress his curiosity either. As he felt someone or something brushing briskly past him, Paul involuntarily turned his head back. What he saw next petrified him in horror. All of them were lifeless and walked extremely gently, as if they were gliding on the ground. Their limbs didn't move. Even their faces had no expression. Their soulless eyes didn't blink, and their mouths remained closed. In fact, their faces seemed to be made of white chalk, so much so that looking at anyone would make his cheeks blush. Paul shivered as he realized that men and women alike were blushing like dolls. As she saw Paul, Akina immediately led him back to her small room. And then she whispered in his ear that he shouldn't step out of the room after 7 p.m. or something terrible was about to happen. He was told to keep quiet and refrain from saying anything, and she would make him leave the island the following morning. At that moment, Paul started to feel that Akina was hiding something, and he watched her skeptically as she left. In the middle of the night, as he was falling into a deep sleep, Paul heard a loud noise outside and was immediately relieved by that powerful sound. People were real. There was life outside. All his fears from the afternoon were now gone. However, he found it strange that everyone was so noisy, so late, and raised the curtain slightly to look outside the window. The surrounding outside streets were crowded with people more or less gathered in a circle and laughing loudly. Deeply curious by nature, Paul completely forgot Akina's advice and sneaked out to get closer to the crowd. He quietly and carefully walked towards where the noise came from. Paul hid behind a large haystack and watched curiously. He then looked at the person standing in the middle of the crowd and realized that it was Akina's father, who was performing some sort of horrific ritual. Around him, the previously inanimate people were now grinning widely, all bearing terrifying looks on their faces, completely ignoring his surroundings and staring horror at Akina's father. Paul suddenly heard a hoarse laugh coming from behind him. Paul's face stiffened in fear. His mouth faltered, speechless, cold sweats trickling down his face. Behind him, the seemingly inanimate people he had met in the afternoon were now smiling and laughing with their mouths abnormally wide open, and all eyes were on him. Panicked and terrified, Paul ran up the main street to escape the crowd, and as he looked behind him to see if anyone was chasing him, he tripped on a cobblestone, falling face down on his stomach. As he lifted his head up, slightly buzzed, a familiar foot appeared in front of him. He began smiling, and as his gaze went up Akina's legs and torso, but it wasn't until he saw her face that he realized the truth in horror. Akina's beautiful eyes were staring at him eerily. Her wide yet crazy smile left him shocked and terrified, speechless. Akina made him stand up and started pointing her finger at him, as if signaling the ghostly villagers to gather around him in swarms, while she slowly stepped away. The following morning, the village square was now devoid of any soul. Its ground was scattered with a multitude of paper dolls, resembling a paper cemetery. In the distance, Akina's father bent down to pick up fragments of a doll, which, unlike the others, had been torn apart. His face remained expressionless as he played with them with his fat and hairy fingers. Akina walked out of the house, beaming and beautiful, and wearing a revealing dress. She purposely stepped on the remainders of the paper doll, at first smiling, until she started laughing hysterically. The aircraft was now landing slowly on the runway at Miyagi's port. As the plane doors opened, a pair of red stilettos stepped out of the cabin, shining in the bright daylight. Akina stepped down from the plane with a seductive smile on her face and whispered, "On to the next one. Let the show begin." Having said that, she smiled brightly again, her eyes glinting with an evil glare.